If you've been following the channel for a while now, you probably know that there is a brand new M2 MacBook Pro coming out very, very soon. Which begs two questions. Number one, what is this M2 MacBook Pro going to be like? And number two, should you wait for it to come out? But let's start off with what this new M2 MacBook Pro would be like, as we've heard a bunch of contradictory reports on it. All of them agreeing on one thing, that this new MacBook Pro would come with Apple's brand new M2 chip. But they do disagree on a lot of the design, feature, and specs elements. The first report comes from leaker Dylan DKT, who's no longer active, but he used to be one of the most accurate Apple leakers out there. And he said that the current 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro would be updated with an M2 model that would use the exact same body as the 14-inch MacBook Pro, including the exact same ports. This seems to me very believable, as the current 13-inch MacBook Pro uses a design that was actually originally introduced 6 years ago. So Apple does need to modernize this whole design. And not only that, but we already know that Apple is also working on a newly redesigned MacBook Air that is also rumored to have a notch just like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro models. So for Apple to change the design of the 13-inch MacBook Pro to match the 14-inch and the rest of the lineup would make a lot of sense. Now, this new M2 14-inch would sell for a lower price compared to the current 14-inch model with the M1 Pro chip that starts from $2,000. However, Dylan did say that it would be more expensive than the $1,300 M1 13-inch. And to reduce that cost, I do predict that this model would also lack the 120Hz mini LED promotion display that we have now. Okay, so this is the first option. Now, the second report comes from DigiTimes, and they claim that the M2 MacBook Pro would actually be identical to the M1 13-inch model, with the only difference being that chip. DigiTimes does have a mixed track record, so I don't really believe this leak to be correct, given what I've also said before, that it would make a lot of sense for Apple to have a consistent design language across all MacBook models. But then this third report was what truly surprised me, as this one is actually coming from Mark Gurman, who's overall the most accurate Apple analyst. And he claims that Apple would be releasing a new 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 chip. So basically confirming DigiTimes' report. But what is weird here is that Mark also states that his new model would be lacking the touch bar, which to me sounds like a 14-inch design, although he specifically said 13-inch. So I just find it weird for Apple to drop the touch bar without any changes to the overall design. And not only that, but we also have a fourth report coming from the same source on Weibo that gave us that very last minute leak that the new MacBook Pro's 14 and 16-inch would have a notch and a black keyboard. A lot of people laughed at him as they did not believe the notch rumor to be true. Like, I didn't even believe it to be true when I first heard about it, but it seems like he was 100% correct. And now he reported that this new M2 MacBook Pro will indeed keep the exact same design as the 13-inch M1 model, including the touch bar, which does actually go against what Mark Gurman was saying. So out of all these four reports, which one do I believe is the most accurate? Are we getting a new design, or are we keeping the old one? Well, we know for sure that this new MacBook Pro will have the M2 chip. That's the one thing that we can all agree on, as that's something that's been present in all of these reports. And 3 out of these 4 reports have been pointing at the design remaining the same. So that's what I think is also the most likely option. As even if Apple were to give us a new design, still 13 inches in size, even in that case, it would be way more expensive to manufacture than just recycling this old chassis and putting an M2 chip in it. However, this does make things a bit odd, as we know that Apple will also be launching the new MacBook Air, which is said to indeed be a new redesign. And this makes me think that the new MacBook Air would actually be more expensive than this new MacBook Pro, as they would both feature Apple's M2 chip, and obviously the one with the full redesign would be more expensive to manufacture, implying that Apple would be charging more for it. So Apple's lineup will be extremely confusing then, as I do believe that they will still have a MacBook at that $1,000 price point, which will likely be the current M1 MacBook Air. The lineup would then be the M1 MacBook Air for $1,000, then the M2 MacBook Pro for probably $1,200, then the M2 MacBook Air for either $1,300 or $1,400, then the M1 Pro 14-inch, for $2,000, and then the 16-inch for $2,500. Yeah, an absolute mess of a lineup. Unless, of course, they have this new M2 MacBook Pro replace the M1 MacBook Air and start from $1,000. But even that would be weird, as in that case, the M2 MacBook Air would be more expensive than a MacBook Pro. Of course, that they could just rename this 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro into simply MacBook. That would at least solve the issue and make the lineup look a bit more normal, as then we would have this M2 MacBook for $1,000, then the M2 MacBook Air for something like $1,200 or $1,300, and then the 14-inch and 16-inch models for $2,000 and $2,500. I guess we have to wait and see, but what we do know for now is that this M2 MacBook Pro would have the same look as the 13-inch M1. Maybe minus the touch bar. But something that you should definitely not wait for is you getting Nordvpn, our sponsor for this video. You've all probably heard about Nordvpn before, so I'm gonna tell you 3 things that you haven't. 1, it's been rated as the fastest VPN out there. Even in our testing, it managed to achieve almost the same speed as without using a VPN. This is thanks to Nord's proprietary tunneling solution, NordLynx. 2, it features a dark web monitor that scans for your leaked data. And 3, you can create custom presets optimized for downloading, browsing, and more that automatically get applied whenever you open an app or go to a specific link. Click the link below or go to nordvpn.com/ZOTVPN to get an exclusive discount plus a bonus. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, you're free to try Nord without any risks. And now, back to the video answering if you should wait or not for this new M2 MacBook Pro. Well, this new M2 MacBook Pro is rumored to come out as early as March, with the MacBook Air rumored for May or June. And since the main change would literally be the M2 chip, let's see if that chip would be worth your while. As some of you might already know by now, the main change that the M2 chip is getting is 2 extra GPU cores, with a bin version only having 1 extra GPU core. That should give it about a 25% improvement in terms of graphics, so if you were to get, let's say, 77 frames per second in a game with the M1, the non-bin version of the M2 would give you 97, which is a pretty big improvement. But firstly, even if I had the binned M1 MacBook Air, I really wouldn't consider upgrading to the M2 MacBook Pro in terms of performance. I've used the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro for an entire year, and my only major issue with it was not being able to connect both of my monitors. The M2 model is set to support 2 4K 60 monitors, so if there's any reason to upgrade from the M1 to the M2, it is literally this, and not necessarily the performance gains. If you're coming from any Intel model, then absolutely, as the M2, based on my calculations at least, would be just as fast as the Radeon Pro 5500M, a higher tier dedicated GPU inside the 16-inch Intel MacBook Pro. Another reason to upgrade from the Intel models is because of the battery life. The M1 MacBook Pro is still to this day the longest lasting laptop out there. Apple rates it at 20 hours, and although I was never really able to get 20 hours with my own usage, I was easily able to get 10. My 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro would only last me for 5. So the M1 MacBook Pro was already the longest lasting laptop that I had ever used. But if you are coming from an Intel MacBook, that is one of the biggest reasons to consider upgrading. My 2020 13-inch Intel lasted me for about 4 to 5 hours throughout my day-to-day use. Bumping that up to 10 would be just incredible, without even considering the gigantic performance improvements that you'll also be getting. Overall, I am a bit disappointed with this new MacBook Pro. I was really hoping of us getting a new design, even if that new design would just be the current 14-inch model. The fact that we're getting the same old 2016 design with just the M2 chip alongside a very confusing lineup is definitely not something that I'm happy with. But one thing that we can all agree on is that the M2 MacBook Pro would be a heck of a good laptop, with best-in-class performance and best-in-class battery life, even if that design is going to be a bit outdated. But yeah, let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about this M2 MacBook Pro? Do you plan on getting one even if the design remains unchanged? And definitely subscribe, because we will have day one coverage as soon as the new MacBook Pro releases. I'm Daniel, this is Son of Tech, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Son of Tech, signing out. Cheers.